Hi, this is Christy from OESD, and welcome to your stitch party. In this stitch party, we'll be creating a mini applique quilt. This little quilt is about 6 inches square when it's finished, and you do the applique and the quilting right in the embroidery hoop. We'll add the border and the binding and a little sleeve to the back of it with the sewing machine. Let's look at how this is made. First, we need some fabrics. The first piece of fabric we'll need is 10 by 15 inches for the background, plus we'll need a piece of fabric for the backing, some small strips for the border, a piece for the hanging sleeve, and for the binding. We'll need 3 applique fabrics, a 3 by 4 piece for the tomato, 2.5 by 2 for the green leaf, and a 1.5 inch square for the button. We will use the OESD Fuse and Fleece Stabilizer for the applique, and we will use a piece of warm and plush to do the quilting. Fuse and Fleece is a lightweight fusible fleece, and it creates a very small amount of loft in an embroidered item. This is a great product to use if you're making something like a mug rug where you want a little bit of loft, but not so much that you can't set something on top of it. It's also great for adding texture to tote bags and trapunto and other things like that. It's ideal for use on woven fabrics, and it's sturdy and smooth enough that you can use it both as your stabilizer and as a lightweight batting. So regular batting is going to be thin and thick in spots and won't provide enough stabilization for your embroidery process. This can be used as your stabilizer. Because we want a little bit more loft in this project, we're also going to use a 7-inch square of warm and plush. This has a little bit more loft than the warm and natural product, about 50% more. So it's good for projects where you really want to highlight the quilting and you really want to get that nice loft in the areas that you've quilted. The warm and plush comes in packages, or you can also get it by the yard. We'll be using the OESD bobbin thread for the applique portion of the design and the isocord colors on the top. Here are the colors that are recommended for the design, but of course you can change them to suit your fabrics or your taste. The last color listed there, the 2532, is a pink color that you can use to quilt the actual quilting area. You may want to choose an isocord multi for your quilting. If you're not familiar with the isocord thread, it is a 40 weight tri-lobal polyester. And tri-lobal simply means that the thread has a ridged area, 3 ridges on it, that allow the light to reflect off of it. It's what makes it shiny. Isocord comes in 423 colors. It's color fast, it's bleach safe, and there's no dye lot. So if you buy a spool and then 2 years later you need to finish a project, you can get the same spool and know it's going to be the same color. Isocord has what we call proprietary twists per inch, and what that means is how the thread is twisted together makes it very strong. It's a trade secret just exactly how many twists are per inch, but this helps keep the thread running very smooth with very little breakage. It's thread that's used by industrial professionals worldwide. If you like the quality of the isocord thread but you want some extra creativity, you can use the multi-thread, and there are 27 colors of multi-thread. It's great for embroidery and it's also excellent for quilting, which is how we'll use it today. The bobbin thread we're using for the applique is the 60 weight polyester. This comes in 6,000 yard cones and it's available in white and black. It's an economical thread and it's very consistent. We do want to use a 60 weight thread in the bobbin for the applique design because we want that satin stitch to be nice and smooth when we do our applique. And so we need the top thread to kind of sink to the back side. That way we don't see any of the bobbin thread on the top and we have a nice smooth stitch. So we want to use that lighter weight polyester bobbin thread in the bobbin. Some other tools we'll be using are our embroidery needle. We'll need our bobbin wound when we get started. We'll need embroidery scissors and in the hoop applique scissors, as well as 505 temporary adhesive spray. And then optionally you can get a display stand to fit your project. The Gross Beckert embroidery needles are the ones I recommend for this project. A size 75/11 is great for this project, and it's going to be heavy enough to go through the fabrics that we're using, but not too heavy enough to cause holes in the fabric. Because it's an embroidery needle, it has a larger eye, and that's going to allow for really good stitch placement and the thread to go through the eye of that needle without shredding. We'll be using the temporary adhesive spray. The 505 is the adhesive spray I like to use. You can use it for basting, applique, or embroidery. It has a high tack, which for this project in particular is really important, especially when we add the batting to the back of our project. We really need it to stick well. It is odorless and colorless, so we can use it and we don't have to worry about an offensive smell. If you are sensitive to sprays or adhesives, any kind of spray in the air, you might want to use this in a well-ventilated area. The 505 also disappears without leaving any residue, and it does wash out completely. The scissors that I recommend for this project are going to be the Easy Snips. Those have the micro serrated edge on the blades that make it really easy to get a very close cut on those little jumps in between your embroidery stitches. And then I also like the 6-inch mini curved handle in the hoop applique scissors. So these have a straight blade but a curved handle. So they're perfect for when we're doing in the hoop trimming because we can get that flat blade up really close to our stitching. Now, one of the things that really makes this project fun are its display options. It's a little 6-inch quilt when it's finished, and there are several different hangers from Applique Manufacturing that will allow you to display a 6-inch quilt. They're made specifically for displaying a 6-inch mini quilt. A couple of options that I like are this heart with the dowel hanger, and because we're adding a sleeve to the back of our quilt, it's very easy to hang it from that hanger. We also have this tabletop stand, so if you want to have a little display on your tabletop, you can get the 6-inch tabletop display, and your quilt sleeve will slide right onto this open area in your stand. So both of these are a really cute way to display your project. Of course, you'll need your embroidery machine, your embroidery module, your power cord, your foot, your needle, your embroidery hoop, and this design is 4.75 inches square, so you'll need a hoop big enough for that size design, and a USB stick to load your design. Let's walk through the steps of making this project. The first thing we're going to do is to press the 10 by 15 inch piece of fusible fleece to the wrong side of our background fabric. So we'll place the fusible side of the fabric against the wrong side of the background fabric and fuse it in place. You can tell on this fusible fleece which side is fusible because the fusible side is a little bit shiny. Once we've got that pressed in place, we'll hoop both those layers as one. Make sure you tighten that screw nice and tight. With this fusible fleece, there's a little bit more loft on it, so you really need to tighten that screw to hold it in place. That's all the stabilizer we'll need for this project. This fusion fleece is sturdy enough that you don't need to float any extra stabilizer underneath. We'll stitch the first color change. That is going to be the placement stitch for the tomato portion of this design. Next, we'll take our applique fabric that we've cut for our tomato and lightly spray the back of it with the temporary adhesive spray. Now, if you like to pre-cut your appliques or you have a tool to cut your applique pieces with, you do have the files available to you to pre-cut it. You can either pre-cut them from a printed pattern, which is on your supply list, or you also have the vector file if you want to use a tool like a cutwork tool or a cutting machine to cut the applique piece ahead of time. I like to cut my applique in the hoop when I just have one and it's a quick project because it goes really quickly. So here I've placed my applique fabric with the adhesive side down, the side I've sprayed, over the placement line. Now we're going to stitch the next color change, which is the cut line and tack down for the tomato. Notice that you've got that double cut line. So you've got actually 2 rows of stitching right next to each other. This is so you can cut very, very close to that cut line. If you don't cut close enough, the edge of your fabric may show around the outside of your applique. So if you cut very, very close, you'll have a nice clean applique. And because you have a second row of stitching, you don't have to worry about even clipping that outer line of stitching. Even if you cut that outer line of stitching, the second inner row will hold the fabric in place. So here you can see how closely we've trimmed that tomato right up to that cut line. Now the next color change is going to be the satin stitch around the edge of the tomato and the details, the pretty little swirls that you see in the tomato. You'll notice when you stitch this design that the outer applique, the outer satin stitch, has a pattern to it. There's sort of a ridge in the middle of that satin stitch, and you'll see a little bit later why that is, why it's not just a regular flat satin stitch, why there's that little ridge in the middle. Now we'll stitch the next color change, which is a placement stitch. This placement stitch is going to be for our button. So just like we did with the tomato, we're going to place the button applique fabric over the top. I've sprayed it with the adhesive spray and smooth it in place, and then we stitch the next color change, which is the cut line and tack down. Now we'll trim as closely as we can to that cut line and tack down and stitch the next color change, which is the satin stitch and the details on that button. You'll notice the satin stitch for this portion of the design is nice and smooth. It doesn't have that ridge. The next color change is the placement stitch for the leaf portion of the design. And just as before, we'll place our applique fabric on top, stitch the cut line and tack down, and then trim as close as we can. The next color change is actually the details, so it's the center portion of the leaf. It adds some details, and then the leaf on the top of the strawberry. The next color change is a brighter green, and that's going to be your cover stitch, the satin stitch cover stitch for the leaf section, and it also stitches an outline around the leaf on the strawberry. The next color change are the pins, so it's stitched in a teal color, and the pins are at the top of the design. The next color change is the white details that go over the top of the satin stitch, and this is where we get to see the reason for that ridge in the middle of the satin stitch. You can see that that triple stitch actually sits right in the middle of that satin stitch, so the ridge gives a place for that triple stitch to sit. Now we're actually going to take our project off the machine, but we're leaving it in the hoop and flipping the hoop over to the back side. So do not take the project out of the hoop at this point, just flip it over. Now we're going to take our 7-inch square of Warm and Plush. We'll spray one side of it with the temporary adhesive spray and then just center it over the back of the design. You can eyeball this. You've got a little bit of extra room with your 7-inch square, so it's okay to just eyeball it and center it over the design. Now I know my piece is not a square, I just cut a scrap, but you will cut a 7-inch square. Next, we'll take our backing fabric and also lightly spray it with the temporary adhesive spray, and then we'll smooth it over the top of the batting. So we've actually created our quilt sandwich here on the back of our embroidery hoop. This is where it's very important that our adhesive spray has enough tack to it. So as you can see, that fabric is just floating underneath. If we didn't have a good solid tack between our fabric and our hoop, we could really run into problems when we go to stitch the quilting design. So we do want to make sure that it's really good and stuck down with that light spray of adhesive spray. Now the next thing we're going to do is to wind a bobbin with a matching thread color. And I'm choosing to stitch my quilting with a multicolor. So I'm going to wind my bobbin with that same multicolor. You won't need to wind the bobbin full, it's just going to stitch a little bit of quilting around the design. So it definitely does not have to be full. In my case, less than 25% was enough to do my design. Whatever color you're using for the quilting, that's the same color you want for the bobbin. So now we'll place the project back onto the machine, remembering that the batting and the backing are on the back side of our hoop. We'll place that bobbin we just wound into the machine and the matching thread on the top, and we'll stitch the next color change, which is the quilting. So you're actually going to see that the quilting will be through all the layers, and the applique will not be through all the layers, so only the quilting will show through all the layers of fabric. It is very important, though, that we have the bobbin thread matching so that the back of our project can look as cute as the front of our project. Now the next color change is going to be a seam stitch. This is going to show us where to cut our project. It will be a guideline for us when we go to cut this project and add the borders and the binding to it. If you want to, you can stitch this with the same color thread in the needle as you did with the quilting. When you go to sew your borders on, that thread may show just a little bit. So if you like that look, you can use that multi-thread. If you want to hide that a little bit, you might choose a thread that matches your background fabric. That way, if you don't get your border sewn on perfectly straight, it won't show. So you may change the needle to match your background fabric to stitch this square. Do, however, leave the same bobbin thread around this square because it's also going to show on the back side. This quilted section, this square, is going to show on the back side of your project. So you do want to leave that matching bobbin thread in the bobbin, and you can just only change the top thread. Now when we finish the design, if we look at the back of the project, you can see here I've got my multi-thread and it's showing the beautiful quilting stitch that's got these nice swirls and buttons that shows on the back side just as pretty as it does on the front side. And that square also shows. Now I'm going to take my project out of the hoop, and yes, I changed background colors because I made 2 of these so you could see some color variations. So here with this project I've taken it out of the hoop and we're going to trim a 1/2 inch away from the seam line. Be sure you trim a 1/2 inch. It'll be tempting to do a 1/4 inch because we cut so many things a 1/4 inch if we're a quilter, but we want to trim a 1/2 inch away from this seam line. That's going to give us enough space to do our borders. The borders go on so simply. We're going to cut 4 1-inch by 6-inch pieces. These will be the borders for our quilt. And what we will do is place one of the 1-inch fabrics right sides together with our little quilt along one of the edges of the square. And then we'll sew it on with a 1/2 inch seam. So what we're doing in essence is actually sewing right down the middle of that 1-inch piece. And when we sew it on, we want to try to sew just to the left or just to the inside of our seam line because we don't want that seam line to show when we press our borders into place. So we're using a 1/2 inch seam here. This is going to give us, first of all, it makes it easier to stitch on. It also gives us a double layer of fabric here so that you get a little bit of a raised look at this border. So we'll do that on both sides. Do 2 opposite sides and then press them back into place. So here you can see we've got our 2 1/2 inch borders on either side. Then we'll do the same process to the other 2 pieces. So do 2 opposite sides and then the other 2 opposite sides. That way your corners are going to be even. Again, pressing back so everything's pressed. And then once you finish, these strips are going to be slightly bigger than your piece. Your finished quilt measures just under 6 inches, so you will need to trim the excess fabric away to match the quilt. The next thing we're going to do is to create the little sleeve that goes onto the back of the quilt, and this is remarkably easy to do. We start with a 2.5 inch strip that's 2.5 by 4.5 inches. Next we're going to fold this in half lengthwise and press it with the right sides together. Then we're going to take this to our sewing machine and we're going to stitch a 1/4 inch seam on each of the ends, the short ends. So we stitch a 1/4 inch seam on each of the ends, and then we clip the corners on the folded edge. Now we can turn this right side out and we have like a little pocket. Press this really nicely, and then you're going to place it on the back of your quilt, and you want the raw edge of your little pocket at the top of the quilt, and this flap, the folded edge, will be down toward the quilt. We will stitch the folded edge down later. At this point, you want to baste this in place. We're not going to permanently stitch it because it will get stitched into place with the binding. But we do want to baste it so it does not shift while we're doing the binding. So use like a 1/8 inch seam to baste that into place. Now we're going to add our binding. Of course, you can bind this with any method that you want, and you can use purchased binding if you like. I used a 2-inch strip that I folded in half with the right sides together. I like to start about 1 inch from one corner. Make sure I start with a securing stitch, stitch down toward the corner and stop a 1/4 inch away, and then stitch a 45-degree angle out to the point of that corner. This will make it very easy to miter the corner because our next step is to fold back that binding strip, and we can use that 45-degree angle we stitched to help us form a nice perfect 45-degree crease in this binding strip. Now we want to take the tail end of this binding strip and fold it back over our project, forming a 90-degree angle here, and we'll have that extra fabric in the miter that's going to make our beautiful mitered binding. When you start stitching the next corner, you start all the way at the edge and then stitch your 1/4 inch seam. So you'll actually stitch this flap down as you stitch across, and then you'll repeat that at all 4 corners. Now when you get to the end of this project, you'll have to tuck the tails together. You might want to sew them together with an angled seam. You might want to sew them together with a straight seam, or you may choose to just tuck one of the ends under each other with a little folded hem. Because we're working with such a small quilt, you'll have to work with what you can manage in that small amount of space to create the end of your binding. Now once you've sewn the binding on completely, you are going to fold it to the back side and either hand stitch it or machine stitch it in place. I've machine stitched mine in place, and I stitched it from the front side and moved it just a little bit, moved the stitching just a little bit to the inside of the binding. Once you've got that binding stitched in place, you're going to whip stitch the bottom of your sleeve. So where the sleeve has a loose edge on the back side of the quilt, take a needle and just use a whip stitch here along that folded edge to tack it to the back of the quilt. You don't need a real heavy tack, so you don't have to have tiny stitches, just enough to hold that sleeve in place so that we can hang it. Here's my finished quilt in another color variation. So we have a pink background and a white background one. And I really like how this looks when we add it to the stand or the hanger. Really makes a cute project. Now this would make a great project for my sewing room. It'd be an adorable little wall quilt or tabletop quilt. What I really think would be fun would be to use the coordinating collection. The coordinating collection for this project is the mini applique quilts, and there are 12 little quilts in this collection. All 12 of them use the same technique where you do the applique first and then the quilting through all your layers. So if you had a cute little stand like this, you could make all 12 quilts and change them out for the month. Let's look at the 12 quilts in the collection. So they are grouped by month. We have a snowman for January, a heart for February. We have an Easter that could be your March or April, and we have a butterfly. Then we go into our summer months with a flower, an ice cream cone, a flag, and a tomato pincushion. That's our sewing one. And then as we go into fall, we have the teacup, we have a bat for Halloween, a really cute Thanksgiving turkey, and a Christmas bell. So you can see that any of these little projects look great on their own, or you could use them as a seasonal swap out for a little display. You can also combine all 12 of these together into one project and use a quilt as you go technique to join them together. To make these designs a little bit more versatile, the designs as appliques alone are also included in the collection. So you have the mini quilt and you also have the individual applique without the quilting stitches. So you can use it on a towel or other kind of coordinating project to go along with your little mini quilts. And you do have on your class files for this class both the project file that is the mini quilt and the individual applique design for the tomato pincushion. I think you're really going to enjoy this collection. So that's our mini applique project. We hope you enjoy making this mini quilt and you'll make tons of them to display and for all your friends. Thanks for joining us.